You're listening to the Monocle Daily, first broadcast on the 17th of October 2024 on Monocle Radio.
Israel crosses off the top line of its enemies list. Now what? Ukrainian President Volodymyr Zelensky pitches his victory plan to his allies. And will a royal visit to Australia only succeed in stirring up apathy? I'm Andrew Muller. The Monocle Daily starts now. Hello and welcome to the Monocle Daily, coming to you from our studios here at Midori House in London. I'm Andrew Muller. My guests Nina dos Santos and Nik Gowing will discuss the day's big stories, and this week's letter is a letter from Chefchaouen. Stay tuned, all that and more coming up right here on the Monocle Daily. This is the Monocle Daily. I'm Andrew Muller, and I am joined today by Nina dos Santos, international broadcast correspondent and former CNN Europe editor, and by Nik Gowing, distinguished fellow at the Royal United Services Institute. Hello to you both.
Hello.
We will have more from you both shortly, but we will start in Gaza and with the death of Yahya Sinwar, leader of Hamas and principal architect of the attack on Israel of last October 7th. In a statement in the last few minutes, the Israeli Defense Force has announced simply Sinwar eliminated. It is believed he was killed yesterday, October 16th. Israeli Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu is due to make a statement in roughly 30 minutes. I'm joined first of all by Middle East reporter Greg Karlstrom. Greg, first of all, how clear are we on the circumstances of Sinwar's death?
I think what's remarkable about the circumstances is that this seems to have happened almost by accident. It wasn't planned. This was, as you said, the person who was at the top of Israel's enemies list, the person they have been searching for in Gaza for a year. But he was found and he was killed by not special forces, not the Israeli Air Force, but by a group of grunts, very low-ranking soldiers who were fired upon, it sounds like, by Sinwar and by other militants in a house in southern Gaza. They fired back. And they weren't even sure at first who they killed. They didn't know that Sinwar was there. They didn't have any reason to believe that he was inside of this house.
I mean, it is now confirmed, but is there any chance at all that Sinwar's passing does mark some sort of beginning of the end of the war in Gaza?
I suspect that it will not, which is not to say that his death is insignificant, and it does present an opportunity if both Israeli Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu and the new leader of Hamas, whoever that is, if they were so minded, they could use this as a moment to try to make a hostage deal and secure a ceasefire. But I think Netanyahu is still not interested in that. He has been very clear over the past year that he wants to continue the war now, not just in Gaza, but also in Lebanon and perhaps elsewhere. And I think Hamas, if they pick a new leader from outside of Gaza, someone along the lines of Ismail Haniyeh, the leader who was assassinated this summer, that person might be open to a deal, but it's going to be very hard for that person to get the leadership of Hamas inside of Gaza to go along with that deal.
On the subject, there's a couple of points there I want to come back to, but on the subject of a new leader, do we know if there was any kind of succession plan? Is there an obvious number two to Sinwar who seems likely to step up?
The succession plans, such as they were scrambled over the summer with Haniyeh's assassination. I think what's likely to happen is they will look for a political figure in Qatar, someone like Khalid Mash'al, who was the leader of Hamas back in the 1990s. They will look at someone like him as a possible successor, as the overall head of the group. But then there's the question of who inside of Gaza will take control of what's actually happening on the ground there. And I think one possible successor will be Mohammed Sinwar, who is Yahya Sinwar's brother, who is quite close to him, quite influential within the military wing. He is likely to assume, I would imagine, a lot of the day-to-day control inside of Gaza.
Is it going to be easy or straightforward for anybody to hold the organisation together, though? Was there any level at all at which, if not necessarily a one-man band as such, Hamas was kind of a personality cult, that without, as I'm sure Israel is hoping, without Sinwar there is no Hamas?
Well, it had become something of a personality cult over the past year. I mean, you had these months of negotiations back in the spring and early summer meant to try and broker a ceasefire. And what happened very often was people like Haniya, the Hamas leaders outside of Gaza, they were willing to go along with it. They were on board with the proposed ceasefire, but then they would send a message to Gaza, and they would have to wait a couple of weeks until Sinwar got back to them, and he would get back to them and reject that offer. So he was someone, I think, uniquely within the history of Hamas, who had the ability to control its day-to-day operations inside of Gaza and ignore the political leadership outside of Gaza. And I think with him gone, you're likely to see a very deep split once again between the people inside and the people outside.
Going back to that question, which is now the key one of how Israel responds to this, Israel has, of course, been under extraordinary pressure, increasing pressure, the longer its war in Gaza has gone on, and not just from people opposed to what Israel is doing per se, but also from Israel's previously broadly supportive allies. How difficult will it be for Netanyahu to press on if in the face of what's likely to be an overwhelming chorus of people say, look, you got him, you've won, you've made your point?
I think it depends on whether it's just a rhetorical chorus from those foreign allies or whether the Americans in particular are willing to put real pressure on Israel and willing to make threats around things like military aid and the supply of weapons. I mean, Netanyahu could very easily say here, we killed the people who were responsible for October 7th. We have dismantled the military leadership of Hamas. We are prepared to make a deal to get these hostages back. You have a lot of people inside of Israel now calling for exactly that. There's majority support for that within Israel. But the problem for Netanyahu, and this has been the problem all year, is that his right-wing coalition partners, at least some of them, don't want him to do that. They want this war to continue. And Netanyahu thinks that it will keep his coalition together by continuing the war, and it will postpone any day of reckoning, both with his ongoing criminal trials and with investigations into what happened on October 7th. And so he has incentives not to end this. He has incentives to drag this out. And I think unless the Americans are prepared to put really serious pressure on him, those incentives are not going to change just because some foreign officials urge him to stop the war.
Well, just finally then, Greg, as an adjunct to that question, are we likely to hear, do you think, both from within Israel, from the Arab Middle East, and also from Israel's allies, at least renewed discussion about where this is going and what post-war Gaza is going to be, who is going to rule it and who is going to rebuild it?
And we're already hearing that. You have, certainly within Israel, people from the security establishment and some of Netanyahu's political opponents from the center-left, who were saying, a sensible Israeli government right now would put an offer on the table. They would perhaps announce a short-term unilateral ceasefire, and then they would put an offer on the table for a hostage deal and some kind of post-war, day after who's going to run Gaza plan. That is being talked about within Israel. That I suspect Anthony Blinken and various European foreign secretaries are having that conversation with their Israeli counterparts right now. There will be a very serious push, both from within and without Israel, around that.
Greg Karlstrom, thank you for joining us. We'll bring our panel in now, Nina dos Santos and Nik Gowing. Nina, first of all, obviously it's impossible to say what is likely to happen next, but could it be that if Israel does just decide to plough on in Gaza, this ends up being one of those major events, which it clearly is, which turns out not to have meant all that much?
Well, the big question, I suppose, is not just what Israel does next, but what Iran does next, isn't it? Because what we're facing today is the fact that of all of those Iranian-backed proxy groups, Gaza, Hamas in Gaza, and also Hezbollah in Lebanon, in very rapid succession, we've seen the leaders be taken out one after the other. And so the question is what does this mean also in terms of whether Israel decides, as you were saying before, to plough on for the last 2 weeks or so? Everybody's been on tenterhooks expecting Israel to retaliate for that barrage of missiles that came over from Iran and, or in its proxies. And that hasn't happened. So what's going to happen now, given the fact that obviously this is another major player who's been taken out and it's not clear who's going to replace him?
Nick, on the subject of Iran's proxies, another major story in the last 24 hours or so, which is likely to get less attention now than it probably deserves, is the fact that last night, according to a press release released by US Central Command earlier today, the US sent B-2 bombers to attack Houthi targets in Yemen. Judging by the press release, the Houthis weren't necessarily the prime audience for that raid.
It was remarkable coming from CENTCOM in Tampa, Florida, what they said about a B-2. B-2 is a stealth bomber. It's got a portrait of 1 meter. That's all that radar can pick up. It is a nuclear bomber. It's a strategic bomber, probably flying from Diego Garcia, if not longer distance. But this is a warning that we can now do this. I mean, the Houthis don't have any kind of defense mechanisms which could have brought down a B-2. So the fact that they've used it is America sending a very clear message that this is the way stuff will be done in future, and we can do it, and we can evade radar.
Well, just to follow that up, Nick, there's not much missing the subtext, and I quote from the press release: the employment of the B-2 bomber demonstrates US global strike capabilities to reach these targets when necessary, any time, anywhere.
That's what a B-2 is designed for. It's a big beast. I've sat in the cockpit once. It was a remarkable thing. And it is shaped almost like a sort of bit of orange peel. It's curved at the wings and so on. But it is remarkable because it's, first of all, its lack of vulnerability. Secondly, its mobility as well. Its ability to evade anyone except potentially the Chinese and the Russians, but they're not involved, certainly for the Houthis at the moment. It was a very clear marker and a very clear warning to Iran. This is what we, potentially on behalf of Israel, could be doing.
But there's also a message being sent there. Stop me, Nina, if I'm reading too much into this. There is a message also being sent there to Israel as well, isn't there? This is the United States saying to Israel, look, if absolutely necessary, we can do this, but it's probably not absolutely necessary right now for Israel to do anything precipitate by itself.
Well, this is interesting because over the last couple of days, since, of course, we've seen the US send those B-2 bombers, as you were talking about, Nick, to take out those weapons installations of the Houthis that, by the way, don't have the same sort of structure as other groups like, for instance, Hamas and Hezbollah that have these charismatic figureheads that Israel has so successfully targeted recently. Just 2 days ago, we also saw the Biden administration briefing that they believed that they had gained assurances from Israel that they would not strike Iranian nuclear or oil sites in retaliation from attacks that they faced just recently. So, I suppose the big question is will all of that hold now, given the fact that we've now seen them confirm that Yahya Sinwar is dead in Gaza, and that'll obviously up the ante for Israel to, from its point of view, potentially hardline members in the government will probably say, well, look, now we want to plough on and head into a bigger conflagration, potentially, with the likes of Iran. Will that type of assurance that the Biden administration has been given, just, by the way, only a few weeks off from a US election, when essentially you've got a lame duck president in the White House, will that type of assurance hold, really?
Andrew, can I just pick up on the question about what Netanyahu is going to do? He's got the wind in his sails at the moment. This reminds me of the death of Gaddafi, who was found in a sewer with his golden gun and just was picked up by a mob and then sort of torn apart. This is what can happen to those who run operations in this way. I think Netanyahu is determined now to create a very vulnerable Palestinian state. He doesn't want a two-state solution. This is now him saying, I can pocket that one, let's move on, both in Gaza and particularly on the West Bank, where the settlers are now getting very agitated. They are becoming very assertive. They are targeting the Palestinians with the backing of the Netanyahu government. Similarly, what is now happening in Lebanon with airstrikes well to the north in the Christian community as well. I suspect very strongly, and having had a number of discussions in the last 2 or 3 days, that Netanyahu feels he has the wind in his sails and he can now do what he really wants to do, which is diminish a Palestinian state and Palestinian presence and create a massive refugee problem both in the north and the south for Jordan and Egypt. This is not just about Sinwar.
And the big question is whether or not he would do that between now and the US election that's taking place in just a few weeks from now, because as we can see, whether it's the situation that we're seeing in the Middle East, or whether it's, for instance, Volodymyr Zelensky, who's here back in Europe today as well, none of these situations are going to be ameliorated by the fact that there's just essentially a power vacuum right at the helm of NATO, because nobody knows who's going to be in the White House in a few weeks' time.
Well, on the subject of President Zelensky, we will look at his meetings in Brussels. He has been meeting EU leaders and NATO defence ministers to pitch to both conclaves the latest iteration of his victory plan. Not every aspect of the 5-point scheme has been revealed, but the broad outlines are known. Zelensky wants Ukraine to have a formal invitation to join NATO in the near future, permission to step up operations on Russian soil, and strengthening Ukraine's economic capacities and its deterrent capabilities. In the last few minutes, he has been addressing NATO. Let's listen to some of what President Zelensky had to say.
There are commitments made at the NATO summit in Washington in July, and we are still waiting for those commitments to be fulfilled. But we are thankful to our partners. It's very important to deliver on what is announced in support packages swiftly. And lives of our soldiers at the front depend exactly on it. And we need to strengthen the training missions and initiatives that really work to protect against Russian aggression, and not only in NATO countries, but also in Ukraine. We have concluded nearly 30 bilateral security agreements with our partners. This is a set of agreements that are needed by both Ukraine and all of Europe. And we count on the readiness of NATO members to ensure the already announced financial assistance to Ukraine in the amount totally of 40 billion euros by the next NATO summit in The Hague.
President Volodymyr Zelensky speaking a short while ago to NATO allies in Brussels. Nik, Ukraine is already theoretically on, quote, an irreversible path.
That was confirmed at the Washington summit.
Indeed it was. So why not bring it forward? Why not just say this is happening and we're going to do it by whenever?
Because of deep anxiety about what is going to happen and the way the Russians will see it. I think, if I may say, that Zelensky is making a big mistake talking about a victory. There's going to be a success, potentially, but I think the chances of getting rid of the Russians out of the east of the country are zero. I think the chances of him restoring Ukraine as it was before the war 2.5 years ago are zero. And I think he's wrong to talk about it as victory, even if in communications terms he wants that the way it's going to be seen.
Well, exactly.
We're going to face a very rough winter because, remember, the Russians are targeting electricity supply stations, generation stations. A lot of the country simply doesn't have power, doesn't have water, and this is at the beginning of winter.
Well, he does need to continue to reject the idea of territorial concessions, and rhetorically, I suspect even acknowledging that for him in the position he's in is probably realistically next to impossible. But should push come to shove, do we start to see now that this is the likeliest end to this, if indeed an end it proves, that Ukraine will surrender some of what it once had in returns for Russia, I guess, shrugging off the idea of the rest of it joining the EU and NATO?
Well, I think some of its international allies will have to front that one, won't they? Because he could face sort of anything from treason charges inside Ukraine if he were to suggest that himself as a president at a time like this. And then, by the way, as we know, the last time he faced election was 2019. So who knows when there's going to be another election, or Ukraine will be able to, avail itself of being the democracy it was before when he was elected. He's coming under huge pressure, isn't he? That's for sure. And he's also cutting a very forlorn figure, sort of shopping around this plan that everybody's sort of raising eyebrows at because they say it's just too ambitious, as you were saying before. He wants NATO membership and he wants to embark upon that course as soon as possible. Obviously, NATO, as a new Secretary General in the form of Mark Rutte, has made it pretty clear that he signals that that's unfeasible. As I said before, nobody's going to take any big decisions before the US election in November. And I agree with Nick in that, this idea of him calling it a victory plan and that Ukraine has to negotiate from a strong position, otherwise it won't be lasting peace, I think is just a bit too ambitious at this point when they're losing huge chunks of territory in eastern Donbass and they still don't have enough weaponry. And as you were saying before, it's cold. Many people are living in buildings where they have no windows, and they're finding it really hard to conscript people into the Ukrainian army.
Andrew, it's getting very grueling on the front as well. They are suffering from training problems. They are suffering from manpower problems. The aging force, people who are volunteering are 39, 40, 50. They are not the 18 or 19-year-olds. And what you're seeing is literally fighting over 20 or 30 meters of land. It is brutal stuff. And Russia is losing 1,200 people a day being thrown forward, First World War style. What is happening out on the front there, the fronts in the east, is really grueling. And I think we can begin to say, in a hesitating way, that we are now beginning to get to that point in any war where fatigue is setting in. And a realization that a stalemate is happening. And therefore, it is the beginning of a process which could lead to contacts, but it's not going to lead to victory or defeat.
But just finally on this one, Nina, is the problem, at least as Zelensky would see it, and it is a refrain I've been hearing from Ukrainians for more than 2 years, and I understand their frustration, that Ukraine's allies are still seem to be proceeding on the assumption that there is a way Ukraine can win that doesn't involve Russia losing.
But as Nick was just saying before, if Russia's willing to throw people at the so-called meat grinder, as they've been describing the conditions, just for the sake of getting 100 yards ahead in territory and just wearing down the Ukrainians, and also depleting their ammunition as well. That's the other big thing. And at the same time, Russia is getting more help from other autocratic regimes. So Volodymyr Zelensky said just at this summit that he believes that 10,000 North Korean soldiers are helping Russia in its advance. Remember that we've got this weird situation where lots of the bullets that arm the Ukrainians come from South Korea, and you've got lots of the ammunition and now more manpower coming from North Korea in Russia. The irony, there are players in other parts of the world that also have a huge stake at this and are continuing to sort of support
But
Russia.
Militarily, it's not achieving anything.
Well, to Italy now, the parliament of which has passed a law extending an already extant ban on surrogacy to include those Italians who embark on such a course in countries where surrogacy is legal, for e.g. most of the United States. The move is being widely interpreted as one of those things where a somewhat cranky far-right party, such as the Brothers of Italy, which leads Italy's governing coalition, attempts to freight some combination of nativism, homophobia and general regressiveness under the cover of family values. It is worth noting, however, that the list of countries which also forbid surrogacy includes Finland, Norway, France and Spain. Nina, do you perceive here a pure-hearted hope of protecting traditional family values, or is it something a little bit more sinister?
This has been a political hot potato that's been bouncing around Italy for a number of years, actually. And obviously now we have Giorgia Meloni's right-wing government with the Brothers of Italy and partners like the League from the north, in charge and are able to put forward this legislation which was voted through. They have, done a lot for political expediency reasons, let's say, to try and, shore up that vision of the ideal family, because Italy has a falling birth rate, as we know. I think it's quite cruel here. Essentially what they're suggesting is to criminalise surrogacy. So anybody who's been found to have been involved in the procedure could be fined £1 million and face 2 years in jail. The League actually wanted something even more onerous. They wanted a sentence of up to 10 years in jail. Now, obviously, people who are in same-sex marriages in Italy say that this means that they'll have to leave the country because they're criminalising their only option at becoming parents. And I will say, personally, as somebody who's lived and worked in Italy many years ago, I know a lot of people here in London who are from Italy. Some of them do have surrogate children, and they're just too scared to move back to Italy in case this type of law becomes retrospective. And, it does seem quite cruel, I would say, and quite political.
Nick, do we suspect fundamentally that this is an extremely thinly veiled exercise in making it more difficult for gay people to have families?
I would come to that judgment, but look, Nina has lived in Italy. I defer to her on this, and I'm quite shocked by the fact that it's happening, but I can understand the politics of what is happening on the extreme right and the populist right in Italy, which is driving it. I think it's going to lead to a lot of very uncomfortable situations for a lot of couples who've had surrogate children, whether men and women or men and women in gay relationships.
Is it a bit weird, though, Nina? Because it is counterintuitive. Well, it's a bit weird at a number of levels, but it does seem counterintuitive, especially given that Meloni has made such a thing about Italy's falling birth rate. You would think she would be delighted by the prospect of Italians wanting to have children.
So, look, the point here is that they say that... the proponents of this legislation say that they want to outlaw exploitative practices in other parts of the world where essentially they say that women are feeling like they have to, for economic reasons, rent out their wombs. But what's not clear here about this legislation, as far as I had a look last time, and this is relevant to lots of Italians who have embarked upon surrogacy abroad, is whether, including countries like Canada, where the process is legal and many Italians go for surrogacy, it's not clear that if the children are born there and have a Canadian birth certificate, for instance, that then the parents would face a criminal prosecution in Italy. So there are a few opt-outs. I think this is largely political, but it sends, as you were saying before, it sends a very sort of unpleasant and illiberal signal in a country that, as you pointed out, Andrew, yes, traditionally loves children. I lived in Italy. I didn't have children at the time. I've got to say there are more children in the UK that paradoxically enough appears to like children less than in Italy, and I know because I've got to now. But I think this is kind of capturing also a certain type of voter that is very religious and has a very traditional view of the family in Italy as well.
Well, let's look now at Australia. And 70 years ago, give or take, Elizabeth II made her first visit to Australia as its monarch. At the time, Australia had a population of perhaps 9 million people. Nearly 7 million turned out to see her in person at some point on her tour. Granted, there wasn't a lot on television. Please do not write in and point out that television did not in fact launch in Australia until 1956. I will not thank you. Even that much allowed for, the reception accorded to her son on his first visit to Australia as its monarch, which is starting more or less right now, is likely to be notably more muted. While there may be as many as a dozen lunatics waving Union Jacks at the airport, 20 deep crowds lining the footpaths awaiting the royal motorcade will be conspicuous by their absence. Nick, first of all, if you're looking at this from Charles's perspective, and it's obviously, to be clear, not his first visit to Australia. He's been many times. He was partially educated there, but this is his first time as king. Doesn't him going just reignite the argument in Australia about why do we still have a king?
I think Nina and I should actually be interviewing you. You are a native of Wagga Wagga.
I am.
And, we should be asking you that very question. What's your answer?
I think it is exactly that. In Australia,
well, there you are.
I think in Australia, Nina, this is largely a dead issue. I remember asking a few years ago Peter Fitzsimons, then the leader of the Australian Republic movement, what the numbers actually were. And he said, honestly, a third favour a republic, a third favour not a republic, and a third don't care. It's not really that big a deal, but this is shaping...
Can't win a referendum on that, though,
You cannot win a referendum on that, which is something we will shortly return to. But does it strike you that this is a bit of an unforced PR clangor? We have the thing where there is going to be a welcome in Canberra.
Why a clangor?
Because not one single state premier is coming to the reception.
I love this.
But the idea is a clangor.
It doesn't look good,
if state premiers don't turn up.
Well, I mean, I grant they're not the most important people in the world, but you would think if you are going to a place as its head of state, which he is, that the state premiers might put in an appearance rather than say, I've got to get the leaves out of the gutters or I have bassoon practice.
They have busy schedules.
They don't really.
I think that says just as much as the climate vis-a-vis a potential referendum. I mean, there's two things that you said, Andrew, I thought was interesting. On the one hand, if you split the vote three ways, you can't win. a referendum.
No.
But if people don't care either way, you're also on a losing wicket, right?
Well, the thing is, in Australia, and the thing, to be clear, if this ever was going to change, it would have to be by referendum because you would need to rewrite the constitution. This has been
tried. The Prime Minister doesn't want to do it at the moment.
The Prime Minister does not want to call a referendum, having got badly scorched on the Indigenous voice to Parliament. We tried this in 1999, and the vote was lost 55-45. Did not carry a single state or territory, unless you count the Australian Capital Territory, which is a fairly small electorate. But it doesn't strike me as an Australian as terrifically important. But just thinking about it, if you were an Australian Republican, Nick, I'm putting you in those shoes.
I look like an Australian Republican?
Very, very much.
Don't sound like one.
One of the reasons I think they lost in 1999 was that they got bounced by the monarchist Prime Minister into putting on the ballot a very low intensity model. Basically, nothing would change except the head of state would no longer have any connection to the crown. It would still be a ceremonial figure selected by Parliament. I think if they put the popular vote option on, it might have had a better chance. But I think the grubby secret of the Australian Republican movement, certainly at the time, was that they kind of feared that if you let the Australian people, God bless them, choose their own head of state, we might end up with a cricket captain or something awful like that.
But King Charles is very frank about it. He says, in the end, if God's own country wants to go its own way, then so be it. He's not that worried about it as king.
He can't really say anything else. He can't threaten to send a gunboat.
Well, we've got very few gunboats to send that distance. The engines will pack up, probably, as we saw with the aircraft carriers.
I mean, Nina, looking at it as an outsider, though, to Australia, as obviously you are, if Australia did announce that we are going to slough off our connection to the Crown and become a republic...
You're not going to.
I know we're not, but if we did, Nina, would it actually cause anybody to regard Australia differently? Would it alter our profile on the world stage even slightly?
I think it makes a difference which generation you are. Probably my mother's generation would be absolutely abhorred at the assumption that could be possible. To people like me, no, I don't think it would make a huge amount of difference.
And You'd have to change the design of your flag.
I'm fine. I'm absolutely fine with that. But again, I would have some concerns about what the options might end up being.
What do you think Barry Humphries would be saying? Because he reputedly came from Wagga Wagga, which is halfway between Sydney and Melbourne.
Roughly. One of his most famous characters, Dame Edna Everage, the Edna Everage lore was that she was from Wagga Wagga. Barry Humphries himself was Melbourneite.
Very much.
Through and through. Dame Edna, well, there's a clue in the name, would obviously be a fervent monarchist, although ironically it was a Republican Labour Prime Minister who first uttered the words "Arise, Dame Edna," Gough Whitlam, who was always fond of boasting that it was the only imperial honour his government ever bestowed.
But certainly, if you remember when Edna appeared alongside Prince Charles, as he then was, with Camilla in the London Palladium, that was a magic moment when he said he had better things to do. So, there was clearly a good relationship there.
And I do think that the King has a great affinity for Australia, actually. He's been there something like 17 times.
He has been
as a young boy.
And
he didn't like Geelong, though, did he?
He liked it more than where he was educated in Scotland, but I think that was a low bar. I will say that I think in Australia he is genuinely quite popular. He does actually come across in Australia as significantly more relaxed and cheerful than he ever does here. It may be the weather.
So obviously the Royals have made a real attempt to try and send a lot of the younger members of the royal family to Australia, haven't they? Has that worked, Andrew? Do you think to sort of get young people interested in Kate and William and Harry and Meghan?
It hasn't. I think I'm right in saying that on the Queen's, what turned out to be the Queen's last visit to Australia, she was significantly outdrawn either just before or just afterwards by Princess, what's her name, that woman from Tasmania who married the King of Denmark.
Mary.
That's her. She turns out to have been more popular in Australia than our actual Queen.
Anyway, we'd like to invite you on our programme again. We're enjoying you. You're a great pundit. So can we book you in the diary?
Yeah, please.
For royal commentary.
Honestly, Nina, that's the dream. Being booked as a royal correspondent. I've got
and a commentator.
I've got a tie at home somewhere.
Can you put it on?
I don't know if I'd put money on that. I know as much as any other royal commentator, i.e. nothing whatsoever. I'd be delighted. Nik Gowing and Nina dos Santos, thank you both for joining us. Finally, on today's show, it is time for our weekly letter from, which in this instance is postmarked Chefchaouen.
It really isn't something you pick up on the way there. The blueness is a little hidden from view on the road into town from the north, but it's pretty hard to miss once you get into the heart of it. Walk the narrow streets and steps of the old Medina, and you're surrounded by a sea of blue-painted buildings. Chefchaouen, a town of just around 50,000 people, quickly lives up to its name as the Blue City in Morocco and abroad. But what's fascinating for a city that is more than 500 years old is just how new all of this is.
We decided to paint the city in blue, all in blue.
This is Mohamed Sefiani, mayor of Chefchaouen since 2009. He spoke to Monocle's Andrew Tuck and Carlotta Rebello at Monocle's Quality of Life conference just last week in Istanbul. And he described how the Blue City campaign started a little over a decade ago.
In 2013, we launched one marketing campaign, territorial marketing campaign. It was inclusive and participatory. So we say the phrase, la perle azul, the bleu perle, yes. A few weeks after, New York Times talked about the blue pearl. Le Monde in France, la perle bleue, El País, etc., etc. In China, and with zero dirhams, with $0, because was a, and now is, for example, we have eco-tourism, and every year more than 30% of increase in tourism.
Thank you, Mr. Mayor. I'll let Andrew Tuck, our editor-in-chief and host of The Urbanist, interpret exactly what that's meant for us.
So the interesting thing is, when you Google Chefchaouen, there's all these stories about how it was the whole city has been blue for like 500 years. Influencers are putting up these stories. Essentially, he painted the city blue. There was a few blue houses. We've been talking about branding. What a piece of branding.
Okay, so there is something a little bit gimmicky about this, but to the mayor's credit, not only did it work, but he's involved the whole city's residents in a collaboration by basically giving them the special lime paint to design their own houses.
So it was a collective and inclusive operation of painting. Before we have some parts of the city paint on blue, but we decided since 2010 to have the painter. And the municipality, we distribute ton of products that we have in France to show. I think lime in white lime is natural product, and now it's expensive. So to all citizens, so women, children, mayor, and elected people, civil society, together.
And it has to be said that while turning Chefchaouen into the Blue Pearl may have started as a marketing campaign, the city already had a lot to work with. It is the second Islamic city in the nation of Morocco, nestled between two national parks and built into Morocco's sloping hills. It really is a pretty spectacular sight, especially if you take a hike up to the Spanish mosque at sunset. The tour group I was with spent a good hour just sitting on a ledge overlooking the city. Just please don't try scaling the steep hill in front of the mosque. We watched far too many people awkwardly working their way up the hill, including through the lavender brush, desperately trying to find the best photo and very nearly plunging down into the well-placed cemetery just below. The perfect selfie just isn't worth it, people. But I digress. The point is that marketing campaign or not, Chefchaouen is one of those clever cities around the world that has literally turned itself into a must-see tourist attraction, the highlight of most people's visits to Morocco. That's true even if, as Mayor Sefiani says, the city remains pretty cautious about how exactly to manage the interest from tourists.
We don't have big companies of hotels. We have a small entity, familiar entity. So we don't have a big industry of tourism. And that gives us to the direct implication of local population to promote the tourism. And we have agreement with the professional of tourism to use good use of water, good use of energy, etc. So we don't want a tourism that will be bad for the city, but a good tourism and ecotourism and responsible tourism.
The eco-tourism the mayor talks about there is his next bit of marketing. That's because Mayor Sefiani is busy turning Chefchaouen from a blue city into a green city. Not literally this time, the blue buildings will remain intact, but Chefchaouen is hard at work making itself sustainable. That includes becoming the first city on the African continent to have 100% LED lighting, as well as using the water that permeates the city through a series of canals. I should add here that this reporter decided to take a closer look at those canals by accidentally plunging into them. My one polite suggestion to the mayor might be to add a little bit of that LED lighting to some extra points along the city's streets next to the canals.
We don't win everything. Sometimes many errors that we have, but in general we have the right city. And the blue city, yes.
Right you are, Mayor, right you are. For Monocle, in Chefchaouen, I'm Chris Chermak.
Thanks, Chris. And that is all for this edition of the Monocle Daily. Thanks to our panellists today, Nina Dos Santos and Nik Gowing. The show was produced by Tom Webb and researched by Sana Jumani. Our sound engineer was Steph Chungu. I'm Andrew Muller here in London. The Daily is back at the same time tomorrow. Thanks for listening.